Thanks to our Patreon members for helping to make this episode possible, and we're now available on all the major podcasting platforms. You can find more information at the links below. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Primates Discover God. And what's fascinating in the history of archaeological history, anthropological history, the evolution of human civilization is that as far back as we can go, and this is like with art and language development, is this capacity for abstraction and imagination extends sort of outward and expands the capacities that humans have from what we understand of the primate worldview. And a big part of this is this sort of, it seems to be a innate cultural evolution that happens, because in the archaeological and anthropological record, it's happened over and over again, is this sort of layering of movement from an animistic worldview, which we'll talk about, to a sort of quasi-animistic mixed to this sort of more concrete version of not monotheistic or polytheistic God, sort of anthropomorphized versions of us to, like the monotheistic, all-powerful, all-seeing, all-knowing, perfect abstraction God that you get in versions of Christianity and in versions of Platonism, for instance. Of course, those two heavily influenced by each other. And so, but it does seem to be innate, and I think it is an expression, again, of this notion of why we see art, why we see language and writing, and why how cities and civilizations are able to evolve is because of this evolved capacity that humans have to expand our sense of the world. And one of them, an important one, is the sense of what might be called the supernatural, but I think that's kind of misleading. So anyway, what happens is, or what the archaeological and anthropological records suggest, is that at the earliest levels or early societies of humans, that we are animistic. And this seems to be like, I can't find a record. That may exist someplace, but it would be rare. And again, the archaeological record for early societies is hard to sort and exactly what's going on. But burial practices, some of the art practices, the anthropological record of more primitive tribes that exist up till today, all point to this notion that we seem at an early stage in our cultural evolution to be animistic. And this simply means that we view the world as living and that we are part of the living world. So this is one of the important notions of animism. It's not that everything else is alive like us. It's that we're integrated into a living world in which, things like mountains have agency in the way that we have agency. We're more like a mountain than we are different from a mountain. We're more like trees than we are different from trees. And so you see the world as living and interactive and responsive and self-directed, in the way that you see yourself, and that this is all together, that we're not separate. Like, we're not a separate thing in the world. We're part of the world, and we should behave in the world and understand the world in the way that a tree understands the world, or the way a river or the moon, that this is our dominant worldview. And you might set some of them apart for special notoriety. For a particularly beautiful tree or a particularly large mountain, you might look at and you go, okay, that's kind of a sacred thing because it's so much bigger and better than us, or more powerful or more interesting. Or like a river, if you really depend on a river for fish and for, maybe small scale agriculture and for transportation, like it's super important. And so you might give special emphasis on the emotional state and the psychological well-being of the river, just like you might give the same attention to your wife or your husband or your children because they're so important to you. And so you see this as sort of a more integrated whole rather than an abstraction or a separation. By the way, this outlook continues till today. It did not go away, right? There's this layering effect rather than a replacement effect, I would argue. And some of the tension that you see in different societies and between different civilizations is the degree to which they've been able to maintain this sense of animistic foundational outlook. And I think it's one of the reasons that Hinduism continues to be such a complex and difficult to understand way of thinking and living, viewed from the outside, is in part because it's, I would say clearly, when you think about animism, it contains so much of that. The world in Hinduism is still alive. Like, read the opening of the Mahabharata or the Upanishads. You read any of it, and you'll get this. But also look at the practices. Look at the worship of the Ganges. Right, the Ganges is a living, noble being. It's not an abstraction. It's a river. You wade into it. You can drink it. Right. It cleanses you. It's there. It's real. It's living. But it's also a god. Right. But it's a god in that sort of different sense of animated, living, important spiritual being that you can also interact with. You can dunk yourself in its sacred waters and replenish yourself. Right. That sensibility is still so powerful in the Hindu tradition that the cultures that have erased much of that, or attempted to erase, I think with varying degrees of success, because I think we really like animism. Basically, I think it's right there. It's really core to us, as we'll discuss. So as we move through, as the primates evolve into larger communities and larger groupings, we carry with us this expansion of our sense of ourselves in the world. And a part of that is, again, an expression of the notion of a greater world that is living and responsive to us, and we respond to it. And so when I talked about earlier, like with a city or like with agriculture, that our sense of time expands, our sense of place expands, also our the aesthetic sensibility that allows for abstraction allows us to build out this much greater sense of the world. And one way of thinking of like an abstract, all-seeing, all-knowing, all-powerful, moving force that animates the universe is as like the ultimate expression of abstract understanding, right? Like, oh, we just really, if we just run with this, we get this bizarre, not very intuitive, but sort of moderately rational concept that is this expression, like this very refined expression of human abstraction, to the point where it's like, I mean, this is the problem with Spinoza, right? Like, what do you mean by God again? Or even Plato, like, what is this totally abstract, perfect form thing? Like, what? Like, on one hand, it kind of is appealing. On the other hand, you just kind of go, the Ganges is a big, beautiful, amazing river. I can literally get my hands around that. And figuratively, in my mind, I can have an emotional and spiritual relationship with that. What is Plato or Spinoza talking about is really tricky, right? Like it's difficult. And I think this is why later religions that as you move the abstraction out, what do? Oh, we want prophets, we want intermediaries, we want priests to help us out, right? You get this like, oh, wait a second, like I need more help because it's like God's getting further away. If the Ganges is there, I don't need a lot of help. I can wade into the Ganges, right? I don't need a lot there. I can do it. I can go on a pilgrimage. I can experience it myself. I can embrace my God, right? And literally. But when God becomes an abstract, Spinoza-esque animating force of the universe, sure, I'm going to want some middleman. I'm going to need some help. I'm going to need a pope, right? I'm going to need a priest. I'm going to need somebody, because I'm like, basically, I don't get it anymore. It's beyond me. And one of the things, and I mentioned this in a lecture, and it's an experiment I've run in several of my classes, but if you want to appreciate animism, like in the Shinto tradition that still exists in Japan today, and by the way, Miyazaki films, many of them are heavily influenced by this sense of the Shinto sense of animism, which is really core to the Shinto understanding of the universe. It's kind of a formalized animism that exists today in modern contemporary Japan. And so again, animism is not done. We're not done with animism. But if we come from a tradition that doesn't emphasize that, then one way to experience this is to just you can run this experiment. Pick a bush or a rock or a tree. but usually smaller is better to start with, I find. And it was something that's out of the way, maybe a little hidden, but that you're going to see every day. Maybe it's by your front door, or maybe it's by your patio out back that you're going to be there. And it's very simple. It's just, if you can do 3 things, and in the morning when you go out, say good morning to it, look at it just for a moment and just like, oh, there it is. Like, how are you? Good morning. How are you doing? When you come in the evening or at night, just go out and say, oh, good evening. Like, how are you doing? What's going on with you? And then if you can sort of think about it during the day, like, oh, it's raining. I wonder how that rock is doing in the rain. I wonder how it's really hot. I think it's in the shade though, so that's probably all right. It's probably doing okay. So if you can just give it a little thought, give it a little reflection, and just talk to it once or twice a day for about a week. And again, your mileage may vary, but generally it's shocking how alive that stone can become, or that bush, or that flower, or that tree. That natural object just all of a sudden will be imbued. Like, we can anthropomorphize in that sense very quickly. And then the debate is, which I think is a kind of a pointless one, but people say, oh, well, we're just transferring ourselves onto that object. And I'm like, well, that begins with the answer and then says, it's just a tautology. It assumes that we don't have this relationship and says, therefore, you're just creating it in your imagination. But it's like, oh, but don't we? Right? And if you feel the emotional contact, if you feel this resonance, isn't that what a relationship is in part? And also, isn't our imaginative capacity to interact with the universe in this way part of an innate human capacity? Like, to say that that's wrong because it's just you is to say, well, but what is the universe but a relationship between me and the things out there, and how I conceptualize that and how I understand that. And then, like I said, just you can run this experiment talking to the moon. I'm a big moon talker. I like to, if I see the moon out and about, I always like to say, oh, look, there's the moon. How's the moon doing? What's going on with you, Mr. Moon? I don't know why, I just like to talk to the moon. But that sense, it's very easy, I find. And if you go out, particularly if you go backpacking or sailing or something like this, it's amazing how alive the world becomes. How you just have this visceral sense of, it's alive, but not in the sense of alive like, oh yeah, deer are alive, but alive like, oh, this is a being or a collection of beings that are working together. So I don't think that sense is very far away, and it's quite simple to recapture it. Anyway, we can track this in the mythological record, right? The ancient Greece is clear on this. You can see this in Egypt. You can see it in China. You can see it in different traditions. You can very much see it in Hinduism. It just never leaves anything, right? So other traditions kind of try to move on. They don't, with varying degrees of success again. But the Hindu tradition just never, just like, we'll keep everything. Like, we're just going to make a bigger bowl that holds everything. It's kind of amazing in that sense. It's too much civilization in a way. There's just, Indian civilization is so old and so rich that it's just like, wow, that's like, you guys are too civilized, right? There's too much civilization. But in the Greek tradition, they actually talk about this. Like, you had the original gods who were just embodied forces like the Pontus, the ocean, and chaos and time and earth and Gaia. And right, you just have natural forces sort of embodied with names. So this is kind of one step removed, where they're slightly anthropomorphized, but mostly they're just the forces of nature. Just kind of like in Taoism, there is the way, it is the power, it is the universe, right? And then you get the Titans, which is sort of the middle period, as they would call it, and which are, again, they are just slightly more anthropomorphized, chaotic actors of embodiments of natural forces. And then you get the Olympian gods, who kind of work against all that, who are human order bringing in theory, or trying to bring order, law-abiding sort of forces of nature, but also not nature. And so you can see this evolution, but again, it doesn't all go away, because there's clearly lots of animism still present in the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Greek mythology. So, for instance, in the Iliad, it's Achilles who goes to war, and I think about it. At one point, he attacks a river because this river god gets so pissed at him because he's so many bodies in the river and so much blood that it rises up and tries to attack Achilles. But of course, Achilles goes, he's Achilles, he's insane. He goes right at this river god, and so the notion that a river is still animated is there in the Iliad, right? And so, you don't leave, right? It doesn't go away. You see it in the Epic of Gilgamesh, this conflict between the new gods and the old forces and the traditions and nature versus civilization. But there does seem to be this evolution that takes place in part with the onset of agriculture and the onset of cities, where as humans, if you think about a world that's not tame, that is natural, where you recognize yourself as subject to and just another actor in this grand natural world that is alive and doing its own thing, to the movement to agriculture, where you're putting ordered pattern quite literally on the planet. That's why I say it's such a leap, such an imaginative leap, to say you're doing geometry, you're shaping the earth, you're rechanneling the water, you're organizing cities, you're creating patterns. And with that, you're creating hierarchy and you're creating specialization. And so the native impulse as a response to this world is to say, oh, the world is orderly. In an agrarian world, you want to assume it's orderly. The seasons come regularly. The patterns repeat. You need to believe that. You can't, because if you don't believe that, you can't do agriculture. Like you just go, well, I'm not going to do something today for food in 9 months because God only knows what's going to happen in 9 months. God literally only knows what's going to happen in 9 months or a year or 2 years or, your time frame. You just go, I don't believe that. Like I have no faith in that quite literal faith. And so as agriculture and cities and the mindset necessary for those to exist expands and grows, it seems to want a order-giving God. It wants gods that give order, that rule, that are knowable and reasonable and rational and humanly conceivable. You can even see this, in fact, between the Old Testament God, like a Job story, where in fact there's a version very much in the Bhagavad Gita story of Arjuna seeing God. But Job it goes through all these problems in the Old Testament, and finally God just shows up and says, "You absolutely cannot conceive of me, right? So just shut up and do what I say, because I'm inconceivable. You're a sad, sorry, hopeless mortal, and I'm just overwhelming you." And Job is just overwhelmed. There's no argument. It's just overwhelming. The same thing happens to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, where finally Rama comes to him and just overwhelms him, and just shows himself. And he says, "Oh, okay, now, yeah, I get it. I mean, I don't get it, but what I get is I can't. It's inconceivable to me. God is so powerful, so abstract, so like there's nothing there for me." And that sort of this conception of God seems to develop, right? But notice this means that now you're in a world where the God is unknowable, and you've moved from a world where it's very knowable because again, the Ganges, you can go in the Ganges, right? You just go, it's very knowable. It's like, in a way, you're like, it's incredibly personal and embraceable. And this is an incredibly different conception of the spiritual, or of the Godhead, of the transcendent, if you will. And so this expression of the unknowability, of the abstract, of the all-powerful, seems to correlate strongly with the rise of a certain kind of civilization based on agriculture, of course. And so that mindset around that develops seems to be, one, a desire for order and order giving and the power to give order, and two, and I think I would, and again, this is where I don't even know how you would prove that. What I would argue is that there is a strong sense of the scribal priesthood, right? When you read Plato, or you read the early Christian monks, or you read some of the Bhagavad Gita, who is this written for? Who is responding to this? And it seems to be like most people seem to want to embrace the Ganges. Again, I'll keep using this example. Or if you're in the Shinto tradition, you want to have your local tree, the local shrine. This seems to be much more pleasing to people. In the Catholic tradition, there were so many saints. One reason there's so many saints is everybody wants their own local saint, or their own personal saint, their own house god, which was the Greeks had. Every house had its own house gods, right? Like this personal, knowable, embraceable, seeable God that is from where you are, grew up where you are, is related to you or in your life experience, versus this sort of more scholastic God that expresses the power and intellect and outlook of a ruling class or a powerful elite trying to shape a world and make the world knowable and controllable and parsable into sections of land. So again, people talk about, the divine right of kings. And it's like, what a bizarre notion if it's the river. Is it the river that said you should be king? Right? Like what? Like, wait a second. Like, no, it's got to be some other kind of God, right? It has to be a God that thinks about human society in a way that cares about hierarchy and stability and land and inheritance. It cares about all that kind of stuff. That is not a tree. Right? Generally speaking, you don't, the animists don't look at trees and go, oh, no, it's like, the tree does not care about all this stuff. If I'm more like a tree, then it tells me I probably shouldn't care too much about that stuff either, because I should care about the kinds of things trees care about, or I should care about the kinds of things the Ganges cares about. I shouldn't care about the notion that there's some sort of God that is like law giving, like laws. Why would a God give laws? Like, what kind of God is doing bureaucracy? The kind of God that comes from a city, right? That's the kind of God that cares about bureaucracy, because wow, our cities really heavily invested in bureaucracy. Yes, they are. And particularly the scribes and the priestly class are very much enmeshed in bureaucracy. And so all of a sudden, you get gods that care about laws and rules and inheritance. And, in the Quran, right, there's all these rules about inheritance and how you can spend money and all this. It's like, where did these gods go? There's a whole different set of gods, right? Like all of a sudden, they seem suspiciously bureaucratic because, wow, all of a sudden when you get this, you get these sorts of traditions developing, and you have cities and you have civilization and you have agriculture, and you have a priestly class, again, who's doing record keeping. This is, as we mentioned, the origin of language, and written language in particularly is strongly associated with the bureaucratic necessities of the priestly class, of trying to keep track of what the hell is going on and who's got what land and all this. And so it turns out that all of a sudden, the gods are interested in these things as well. You see this in Egypt, right? Like this, you have scribes, you have gods who invent writing and who are scribes for the other gods, right? Like there's scribal gods. You know who came up with that? Scribal priests, right? Like they were like, what would be a really great kind of God? Would be the kind of God that takes notes and writes things down. Let's have one of those. And so this evolution you can see even in the content of religion. And it's not a way we tend to think of it, but I do think it's a great way to understand how we've evolved from primates who, as far as we can tell, don't have this sensibility, to, as our imaginative and abstraction capacity for abstraction develops, and our love of art and our love of narrative and story and language, one of the stories we tell ourselves, and which makes total sense, is like, how do we work in this world? Where's our place in this world? What's going on? How am I like a tree? Am I not like a tree? Is the Ganges living or not living? And I think if you go to these big rivers and you stand there, you think, yeah, Hinduism's right. Like this is definitely like animism, or this is definitely a being, right? It just has that sensibility to me. All the way towards like all of a sudden, what do we care about? We care about rules and laws and ownership and property and justice and these kinds of concepts. And suddenly, so do our gods. All of a sudden, our gods are giving commandments and rules and laws and, concerns with kings, right? All of a sudden, kings get divine rights from gods. And you're just like, okay, but what a wildly different conception that seems almost necessarily to evolve with us. And so when the primates begin discovering gods, we're not done. And I'm absolutely certain we're not done discovering gods yet. So, people, this is one of the fascinating things is that we keep, reinventing the religions that we have, reinterpreting them, re-understanding them, reconceptualizing them. The hilarious one is, of course, that in the United States, Jesus is white, which is, it's just so hilarious. Anyway, so white Jesus, I love white Jesus but of course you're going to reconceptualize God to be like you because, what else would you do? And so if you're white, then you think, well, God must be white. He couldn't be this, North African kind of maybe Semitic kind of guy. No, he's going to have blonde hair and be very, very white, probably with blue eyes. Like that just seems the most reasonable. He's certainly not a Semitic North African peasant who was sunburnt and dark-haired and dark-skinned, and no, that's not viable, right? We know that can't be good. So we're continually reinterpreting our gods and making new understandings of them as our conceptions of the world changes, as our sense of our lives change. And I think this is one of the fascinating aspects of contemporary culture is there's this big movement, which I may talk about in a separate lecture, to understand like there's that we live in a simulation. And in one way, this is just, as I've mentioned, just an articulation of medieval theology, which is itself a rearticulation of Platonic theology or metaphysics. And because that there's a real world behind this technological face of the world that we inhabit. And that if we just, get through it kind of the matrix-wise, we'll see that there is this other world that is the real world. This is just new. This is just new religion, new understanding, like trying to reconceptualize a world that has more of a place for the impact of technology and incorporates that into it. Because one of the failings of these old times religions is they don't seem to talk about computers a lot and digital kinds of technological issues very much. And so we want to both interpret our technology in the terms of our old religions, but at the same time, our concerns and obsessions with technology will reinterpret and recreate those religions anew. That's just one example. There's many others you can look at. The environmental movements in many places take on a cosmological language closely associated with like a reanimation of the universe. Like if you've heard of the Gaia hypothesis, it's just animism with some footnotes from science. Like which just doesn't make it bad. It just means it's not very sciencey, but it is very animistic-y, and it's trying to reimagine the natural world back almost to the way it was, except for now we're going to pretend like it's got a lot of science behind it. And that sort of continual reconceptualization and recreation of our cosmological sense of the world seems to be innate, seems to be a necessary component that allows us to frame and understand the world. And so once we have the capacity for narrative, once we have the language that allows us to do it, and we have the imaginations that's allowing us to create art and imagine the world not as it is, we seem to ask and fill in this question of where is the world? Where does it exist? How do I relate to it? What's my place relative to all of these other things around me? And the transmogrification of those outlooks and that capacity through time and through the dynamics as civilizations develop along their different courses, is to me one of the most fascinating stories in the development of our primate capacities, because it is just this continuous evolution. It never stops. It's always responding to contemporary environments. And you've seen such a diversity of outcomes. So again, Hinduism has kept almost everything. Shintoism has kept a lot of the animistic tradition. In fact, I think it's functionally just fancy animism in a way. I mean, I don't mean that in any way derogatory. It is so powerfully animistic, and it just speaks to the fact of how much we like to keep that alive, all the way to the most abstract sort of Platonic, remote gods of the deists, right? Who are like, oh, there was a God, it made the universe, and then it took a vacation. It's off. I don't know. It's off someplace. So, all of those capacities and different ways of trying to understand and recognize the world and our place in the world seems just inherent once these forces begin to work on us and once our minds become open to it. And so when we think about religion, when we think about God, when you hear people speak about it, one way of approaching this and one way of thinking about it is to reflect on how it is evolved over the millennia to reflect and respond to the differing needs of human societies that are in different stages of development and under different stresses, and asking different kinds of questions, yet always wanting this imaginative capacity to animate some part of the world that is not us to be there. So it's just been this, millennia and millennia long dialogue with the external, asking, where do I fit? What am I doing? Why does this exist? What's going on? And that dialogue just never stops. And I can't imagine that it ever will stop. And like the attempt of totalitarian rulers to stop imagination, right? Again, like I mentioned this before, they always want to cut imagination off. I think you get the same thing with theocracies and theocratic societies. They need you to stop imagining gods and God and your relationship to them. They need to be able to tell you how it is. But I think this is impossible. Functionally, it can work for a little bit, but it just doesn't work well, because it seems to be innate for human conditions, which is variable and changeable over time, and as other things change around us, to continually reimagine and reconceptualize this fundamental need that we have to communicate with and understand ourselves within the complexity of the universe, and with our minds and with our capacity for abstraction and creativity. Wow, we're just not going to stop. So the prophets will keep coming, even though you have many religions that say, no, we're done with there are no more prophets. No, the prophets will keep coming, I think, because they always have. And the gods will keep changing, and there'll be more of them, and there'll be new ones, and old ones will fade. And it's why one of the great articulations of atheism one time I heard was, if you say an atheist and they say you don't believe in God, the response, or a response, is to say, well, I believe in one less God than you do, because there's thousands of gods that you don't believe in, and there's 1,001 gods that I don't believe in. And articulated that way, what you realize is like, oh yeah, we love creating gods. It seems to be a very human and a very socially human undertaking. And we just really get a lot of satisfaction, and it gives us a sense of order and belonging and meaning that somehow grounds us and makes us feel better. And so that's the kind of conceptualization that is present, and it is just not going to go away. I don't see any evidence. I still don't see people talk about, the spread of atheism, blah, blah. You scratch the surface on that atheism, and what you find is generally people will talk about the importance of spirituality without the importance of the gods. And boy, pretty quickly, you're like, we're getting back to animism, right? Like this becomes animistic very fast again. And so again, what the expression is changeable over time, but that core seems to be there right from the off. So as we carry our imaginations into the future, and as our futures change and our civilizations are dynamic, we can transform it. But I just don't think the primates are ready to give up their gods. Once we've discovered them, we just seem to really love them. Thank you.